Uh, Hello, Susan.
Hello, can you hear me? Yeah.
Yeah,
Yes, I've just left my class left next door, which has unfortunately gone overtime. So but as long as everything's set up, I'm okay.
great. And you're looking great in pink.
Yeah.
It's a, it's a nice colour for our cold, wintry day here
Mm,
in Buden.
hmm.
Um, Susan, sadly, you can't see the audience, but you can see me.
Hmm.
And it's through this camera here. But thank you for joining us. And obviously, as you kind of indicated, you're now at Goldsmiths, just finishing teaching. I'd like to say hello to everybody here. My name's Onkar Kula, and together with my colleague Christina, sat to my right here, we're the co-curators of the Lulioga Biennial. And the biennial, together with Harbour Magazine, it is the co-host of this event. And we've invited Susan as a part of the biennial, as one of the participating artists, and partly to do connected to the work that she's been doing over the last number of years, and particularly in relationship to the work that she's been doing around ice, and ice as a kind of as a materiality that holds certain kind of forms of information that can be registered and kind of thought about and can also be used in various forums. And Susan describes ice as a kind of a material witness, one of the most kind of compelling earth evidences around for our current climate catastrophe and crisis. And Susan has been for a number of years developing ways to register, look at ice, and kind of, understand it in various contexts. And one of the reasons that we wanted to invite Susan, as well as the work that she's been doing on ice, Susan has been developing practices around listening. And listening and learning is a kind of key kind of principle together with Christina and myself that we've been working with throughout the production of the biennial, and really trying to think, okay, well, how do we kind of activate various forms of listening to develop the biennial across different sites, across different kind of organizations, across different practices, and also across different communities. And so there's a kind of a double aspect of this kind of invitation. And so once we started a kind of an email dialogue, one of the invitations to Susan was to say, okay, well, how do we kind of maybe engage with your practice within the kind of program of the biennial? And I invited Susan to participate in some sort of kind of listening event. I said to Susan, could we do some sort of listening event? I think you kind of fired back 2 minutes later saying, actually, I'm about to release a record, and maybe we could just listen to the record. And I was like, wow, you're actually a record release, a proper record release. So I feel kind of really honored also to be on stage, kind of partaking in the kind of record release. This is my first. So thank you, Susan. And I would also like to say just a bit of kind of housekeeping. We have very kindly, Harbour Magazine, it's a very kindly organised some kind of snacks and some iced drinks over in the corner, over in the corner there. And and with that, I will kind of leave it to Susan to give an introduction. So the idea is that Susan will do a kind of a brief introduction of the record, and then we will play side one and play it through, which is around 28 minutes. And we'll turn the lights down and we will just sit and listen. And then track two is a singular track. So side one is made up of around kind of 8 ice recordings that vary in different ways, and Susan will kind of explain a bit more. And then side two is one singular track, and I suppose it's up to you as an audience how you want to kind of sit with that. But we'll see how things kind of move forward, because I think it's another 27 minutes. So let's see how much kind of energy we have for that. But we can also just kind of completely chill out and just listen, which I think is great. So Susan, over to you, and thank you.
No, thank you, Ankur, for both the invitation to participate in the biennial, but also to to be able to in some way eavesdrop in on this listening session that you've organized. And we met earlier online, so I really like the ways in which you've set up the kind of space and how the album will be playing there as an actual vinyl record. Oftentimes, even if you produce a vinyl, people will inevitably ask you for the digital files or something like that. So really appreciated the fact that people will be actually listening to the grooves of this seemingly icy record. I wanted to share a few images, if I might, just to give a sense of the context out of which these recordings emerge. So if you were to, shall I share screen right now, or?
Please, yeah.
Okay. Yes, so for those of you, obviously in the actual cafe, you have an opportunity to see the record, and I think for those of you online, you'll have a bit more of a kind of snapshot. But I was really keen to actually produce, to gather my field recordings, and the field recordings are both comprised of audio recordings that I've done, but also audio recordings that have been shared with me, primarily from by glaciologists. And some of those glaciologists actually work very directly with acoustics as a mode of as a new form of instrumentation in doing analysis of glacial dynamics and glacial changes to the mass balance of glaciers. In other cases, scientists have done acoustic recordings to gather evidence of glacial melt. So the field recordings, as I said, come out of research projects and field work that I've done, but also go further back in time, and as far back as 2009. Why? I felt this is really important, and there's this play in the title of the album. The album is it called Ice Records, or could we say Ice Records? So Ice definitely records, that is to say, it captures evidence evidence of atmospheric change, or the changes in atmospheric chemistry are archived in ice samples. And here in my hand, I'm holding a chunk of Antarctic ice, but we can see these little tiny air bubbles. And that's why when I say that ice samples are like paradigmatic material witnesses, this is essential, because what we have in those little pockets of air, we have the actual material residue, if you will, in the form of gases, atmospheric gases of another time. And the ice core record, this is an ice core. My first documentary dealt with ice core science. This ice core, and here we see scientists starting to cut up the core in half, mark it, cut off particular chunks that will then be sent out to different sort of laboratories for other scientists to work on. these ice cores are essential for producing the claim that the atmosphere has been warming now, in particular over the last 200 years. And the ice core archive goes back almost a million years at this point, but it's considered to be a very high resolution, or it's considered to furnish a very high resolution data set because of the fact that there are multiple annual layers of snowfall. So in the polar regions, obviously anyone living in Sweden knows that there's, hundreds of snow, you know, hundreds of layers of snowfall might accumulate in the course of a single kind of year. Every time there's snow, it's capturing air, and over time, that air that's captured in snow will be compressed and sealed off and produce a kind of earth archive, if you will. So the records that I'm referring to are both the records of climactic histories that are captured in ice, and then also the album is itself an ice, it's a record. So I was sort of playing with this double notion of the word record. So both to record and also an album as a record. This is a shot from the Belcher Glacier in Devon Island, Nunavut. And so the oldest field recording that we'll hear, which Martin Sharp, who's a glaciologist based in Canada, he produced an audio recording of the melt of the Belcher Glacier, and he actually submitted that as evidence to the International Panel on Climate Change, as a kind of, not as a sort of scientific kind of proof, but to somehow, in the midst of these kind of policy debates, in these large institutional forums and gatherings, he also wanted to somehow bring the participants bring them closer to this event of warming and to really understand the sort of dynamic changes that are taking place in the Canadian high Arctic in a massive glacier like the Belcher Glacier. This is a more southerly glacier. It's the Athabasca Glacier in Canada, and it's receding at a kind of dramatic pace. So over the course of 40 years, it's probably receded a couple of kilometers now. And when you're at the mouth of this particular glacier in Canada, it's really a kind of slushy kind of mass. Now, but it's been it's probably the most kind of, this is a more southerly, most symbolic glacier in sort of Canadian consciousness, and the one that's certainly been the most sort of documented by sort of geographic kind of expeditions, etc. Part of my research has taken me to the Svalbard Arctic Archipelago, and a few years ago, I was able to circumnavigate the main island Spitsbergen with Miriam Jackson, who's a glaciologist, and we spent time, observing different glaciers, etc. But I also, through my interest in Svalbard, met Oscar Glowatsky, who is he's based at the Polish Institute of Science in Warsaw, and he works out of Hornsund in Svalbard, and he's one of the pioneers of the use of underwater acoustic sensing to understand the changes in glaciers in Svalbard. He works with another scientist, Grant Dean, and is really a Oscar and Grant that I was really introduced to the use of acoustics as a mode of measuring and monitoring glacial changes. Glaciology historically has predominantly been studied in the physical sciences. So the use of remote sensing has been very transformative to understanding the glacial ice sheets, but acoustics is considered a very experimental science. in relationship to glaciology. So, in as much as this glaciology is very indebted to the physical, to earth sciences, the modeling of ice caps is really something that remote sensing platforms have enabled. And but acoustics is another mode of investigation that is, has the capacity also to perhaps slowly transform the field again. And this is one of the acoustic arrays that Oscar uses in Svalbard. And so one of the recordings that we'll hear is it's a very unusual recording because we're going to hear a really peculiar sound, which actually is the sound of a bearded seal. I won't say more than that, but I think you'll recognize this very strange, otherworldly sound when it appears. And it was through the interactions with Oscar and Grant that I decided to work with collaborators in India, in the Ladakh region of India, of northern India, and to try and work with an ocean instrument called a sound trap long-term recorder, and start to attempt to bring acoustic sensing also to the study of this particular glacier in the Himalayas. And there we are paddling to the mouth of the glacier to lower the instrument. This is the instrument here. So this instrument, a Soundtrap long-term recorder, can produce a recording of 6 months, like a 6-month real-time recording, and as I said, it's an ocean instrument. It must sit in a body of water in proximity to a glacier to actually function. But every glacier actually has a unique acoustic signature. And if you were to do annual acoustic recordings of, a specific glacier, you would see the changes, and you would start to understand what the different frequency events actually signify, from something dramatic like a calving event to other frequencies that wouldn't produce this necessarily the same kind of spike pattern, but would give you a sense of just how dynamic the glacier is. The release of air bubbles, those air bubbles I showed you at the very beginning in that image, that are, that's compressed atmospheric gases, carbon and methane in particular, or CO2 and methane. So when the ice melts, those bubbles of captured air burst, and you can hear that underwater. So that also gives us a sense of the melt pattern. So this is some of the kind of more technical scientific work that we were doing in Trengdung Glacier in Ladakh. But we were also working with more simple hydrophones on the glacier, and working with local there's Faiza, one of my collaborators. She's doing field recordings. That's actually part of the glacier. It's just covered with debris. So we were working with, as I said, more kind of different recording devices to also do sort of field recordings, and also work with local mountain villagers to produce, or rather to have workshops and have encounters on the glaciers with them. So this is a moulin. And here we have a number of women from Akshau village, and they're just pressing their ear to this moulin and actually listening to the internal life of this glacier with a sort of human ear. So, in as much as we're using sort of more techno-scientific instruments, we're also working actively with local mountain villagers who are experiencing extreme water scarcity as a consequence of glacial recession in the Himalayas, and trying to think about the ways in which science could produce certain conditions of hospitality and bring so-called non-experts into a listening experience so that people would have some sense of what was at stake in the, let's say, more technical work that we were doing. And so here we have another listener who's now got headphones on, and she's listening to a hydrophone. And what she's listening to, I'm also recording. So the kind of tracks that we'll hear shortly include some of these experiences where the villagers are listening, and we'll hear them actually talking about what they're hearing on one of the recordings. So I was always like recording the encounter or the act of listening as well. And then finally, just to sort of wrap up this short sort of preamble to the tracks, um, as part as in this sort of attempt to develop acoustic or to develop methods of listening to ice. So to try and use the field of acoustic scientifically, but also the condition of listening, hearing and listening was also essential to just listen to the stories of climate change that people were expressing in their day-to-day sort of lived experiences. So, in this one case in Leh, when we eventually were spent some time in Leh, we met an elderly man, Marup Namagayal, who's a song collector, and here are scraps of paper from his personal archive where he has collected songs about mountains, glaciers, rivers, and streams over many decades now, as an attempt to archive the sort of disappearing knowledge of these environments that were captured in poetry, in sort of folk songs, etc. And so, in spending time with Marup, he expressed a desire, but also an urgent need for these materials that he's been collecting to come together in some sort of songbook that he could then use in workshops and that schools could have so that this sort of legacy and history wouldn't simply vanish in the same way that the glaciers themselves are vanishing. So we produced a, a book called Singing Ice, which has the translations of all the songs and in Bodhi, Ladakhi, and English. And this song book Modup is used in workshops, but it's also been sent to all of the schools in the region of Ladakh. So um, oh yeah, and there's an image of the inside of one of the spreads of the songbook, and Jigmet, a local illustrator who's based in Leh, um, we commissioned Jigmet to produce illustrations, and she uh, went to the local glacial stream that feeds her community and used the water from that stream as um, the water that she used, and then producing the illustrations for the songbook. So I wanted to just highlight some of these different ways in which um, the tracks are all organized around listening to ice, but it's listening both from a sort of techno-scientific perspective, but also listening um, to an environmentalist, and to listen to the sort of the ways in which the ways in which environmental histories themselves are archived in folk songs and in cultural traditions. So the project and all my work really tries to move between these different registers and scales from as I said, from the techno-scientific to situations of um, local knowledge and also inquire into local knowledge practices around glacial care, etc. So I think that probably gives you a little bit of the context out of which these different tracks emerge. So I think I'll leave it at that, and then we can. So maybe I will stop sharing. Um, which now I seem to be. There we go. Stop sharing. Yeah, so I'm back, and I think we can go ahead with the listening session, because it doesn't make sense to stop it. I think it should just be a sort of continuous flow of sound. Yeah.
Um, Thank you, Susan. Great to have that kind of quite extensive introduction. I would also add, kind of talking about the kind of when you're talking about the kind of inside of the publication, there's an extensive inside of the LP too. There are kind of extensive field notes that you've written that kind of move from the diaristic to kind of quite kind of powerful observations of the work that you've been doing. I will hand out the kind of field notes for people to kind of to read in between. But as we discussed earlier, I'll be acting as your virtual arm and putting on the record. But please, if you feel like you need to stop the record, just put your hand up and I can do that for you. Yeah.
Oh no, I won't be stopping the record.
Okay.
But people shouldn't feel trapped by the listening situation. They should do it. Yeah, you have a better sense, especially if you decide to play the second side, which is a very different kind of. Maybe that's the only thing I didn't mention. The second or the side two of the album, which I'm not sure. Perhaps we'll play it, but perhaps it'll be a more. It won't be as much of a kind of focused listening session. The second side is as a musical piece that I had a score. I commissioned a friend who's a musician to produce a score for a film project called Svalbard Archipelago that mixes a lot of my field recordings, and but it's an electronic composition, so it's very, very different. So we are going to hear all of the field recordings that are relatively raw, and then if we decide to listen to the second side, we're going to actually encounter a very different kind of track, which is comes out of like computation. And that doesn't come out of the field, but incorporates some of the field recordings. But it has a very different sort of obviously aesthetic sensibility.
Great. I will move on to side one then.
Ice talks a lot, and it seemed like a nice creeper. If we stand inside an ice creeper during the day, it will have sun is there, becoming a crack. You can hear it. You can hear when you're walking on ice. During the night, when it's melting, the water is sprinkling up and falling and instantly becoming ice like that. You can hear it. Yes, it's a very interactive. Ice, water, I mean, these kind of things, they are more like living. They communicate. It is up to you if you can reply back, basically, or if you can hear and understand.
recording the stream, going into a crevice, and I will switch to the hydrophone now.
It is heading into sound community. One that is boiling water, boiling tea, that everyone knows them again. And then they are also giving some nice going with the flow of the water. So there is very much keep on moving on. The one more thing. So రాముడు కేతే ఎర్రల కాసులున్నాడే నాడు లాటే నాడు.
Hi, Susan. Shall we go straight to slide 2?
Sure, you're probably a better judge of reading your audience than I. Yeah, I can't see anyone. So,
Yeah, you can just see me,
yeah.
and I'm well awake. But no, I think we can start, and then we can just see. We can play it. Well, it's around 25 minutes, I think. The second.
Yeah, no, maximum, because that was an interesting thing I found out about the grooves in records when mastering it. The louder the sound, the more physical space they take up on the surface of the record.
Right.
So we had to make wider grooves for these very loud sounds when the ice is hitting the sensor in different moments. So, yeah.
Lovely. And I was just thinking with side 1, some of those sounds, you just want to grab hold of them. I mean, they're just so textural. I mean, you feel like they're so material. You really want to kind of grasp them in some way.
That's a nice way to think about them. Yeah. Grooves for these very loud sounds when the ice is hitting the sensor in different moments. So.
not sure if that's the end. Susan, is that the end of the record? It's still going around.
So, I mean, I can't hear anything right now.
like the end. Hi, Susan.
Yes, I can now. Yeah, for some reason I'm not hearing the music, but that's fine. I was just waiting for you to come back online. Yeah.
Okay.
Mhm.
Um, I slightly acted prematurely. I thought the record was ended, but it hadn't. There was a kind of a pause moment towards the end. Couldn't quite read the vinyl. But I would. I said the record is.
Yes, I can
by
now.
two
Yeah,
producers. Was
for
it
some reason I'm not hearing the
together with
music.
Mohammed Safar? Is that correct? Yeah.
Yeah,
And it acts as a film score.
that's right. I mean, I thought it was a sort of beautiful piece of music, kind of in and of itself, even though it does have these sort of gaps, which I didn't want to actually ask Muhammad, or he goes by his last name Safa. I didn't want to ask Safa to sort of have to produce new materials, so because it was um, conceptualized in relationship to images, there are these moments where the sound really falls to the background, so to speak. But and you can, or there's a change in the rhythm of the piece that for a purely auditory kind of experience might at moments seem slightly off. But I just thought I would, it's named as a score for a film, so I think it's okay. And I just wanted the work to have maybe a bit of another life beyond just having to see the video projected in a gallery somewhere. Yeah, and it seemed like a nice way to combine the field recordings and then see how that could then be translated into another piece. Because just to say that in my actual like creative practice, when I produce the sort of documentary works that I do, I put a lot of effort into trying to denaturalize these landscapes and these images, and then sound has a crucial role to play in doing that. And so sometimes really shifting from the more sort of naturalistic sounds to something that the way I would characterize it has a more transmissional quality. So I'm really trying to think about these transformative geographies in terms of the ways they transmit signals of climate change, for example, and so I often will use a certain more contemporary sort of synthetic kind of acoustic language, I guess, to do that, and harmonics and things like that. So I think it's nice to always have multiple sort of registers in a piece. Yeah.
And our time is coming to a close.
Mm-hmm.
But just to the record is kind of materialized. It's gone into kind of like vinyl.
Mm-hmm.
How do you think it might kind of, or how do you expect it to act, or what do you want it to do as a kind of as a piece of music? I mean, have you got other formats for sharing it? Are you kind of thinking about other forms of kind of listening to that record, how it might kind of activate itself in other contexts, for example?
Yeah, I mean, what I was keen on was what I like about the analog and the vinyl record in particular was the ways in which once again it relates to my interest in how the ways in which materials register events. And so, like, as an album gets, say, played increasingly, like the scratches, the noise that starts to become part of the material sort of substrate is also then becomes part of the record of it's like the playing and the scratches and those artifacts then are also inscribed into the vinyl kind of album. And so for me, it was really, I think I like the idea of the record. Uh, it carries these recordings from these different glaciers, but the record itself is also going to undergo transformation and change in the, and so I was, it's not answering your question directly, but I was really interested in sort of analogies between the sort of material substrate of the record with its, and it's kind of like a topographic landscape. If you looked at it, a record microscopically, it has a certain kind of like peaks and valleys. So it is a kind of geography of the surface of a vinyl album. And I like the idea that it could then also accumulate these sort of, as I said, the artifacts over time and be kind of also actively recording. I think analog materials can really do that really well. And to me, that vinyl album has much more of a direct correlation to, say, an ice sheet than, say, a digital set of files. And the one thing I didn't mention at the beginning was also important to me was the ways in which early atmospheric meteorological instruments would, the ways in which early measurements of precipitation and atmospheric pressure, etc., they were captured by instruments attached to balloons and kites, and this process was called soundings. So you would these instruments would produce soundings of the air temperature and atmospheric kind of pressure, and they would record these soundings with a stylus in a substrate. And so there were basically a kind of drawing, if you will, of the atmospheric conditions. And that term still exists today, and they now call it radio sounds or radiosondes. But there was a direct relationship to the stylus of these instruments to measure atmospheric conditions, and the fact that the term sounding itself was the ways in which that process was described. I also found that a really nice sort of correlation. And then when I was actually getting the vinyl tracks, I had to get them specially mastered for vinyl. And the person, Luis was his name, who was helping me do that, he said, like, oh, Susan, you know that every recording that you've made, these field recordings that you've made, that the air temperature on the day that you made that and the air pressure on the day that you made those recordings is also registered in the sound, because air is a medium that sound waves pass through, and temperature and barometric pressure affect the quality of the sound. And I thought, oh, that's a brilliant insight, that these acoustic tracks are also records of the atmospheric conditions on the days that they were made. Not the underwater ones, but the ones that were made, say, more above ground or something. Yes. So I liked all of these moments of convergence where, like where sound and air is medium, and the fact that temperature is actually being recorded in the sounds of, say, ice, for example, which seems very counter intuitive, that, oh, how do you record temperature in sound? Now, I don't know whether one would have the means to decode that, say, forensically, but presumably there might be a method to do that. But just to say that I was really keen on the ways in which these different sort of histories of meteorology, the ways in which sound waves pass through a medium like air or water, affect all of the ways in which these sort of like points of convergence seem to suggest to me that a vinyl album was the right way to go about, like, producing this analog material object was the right sort of move to make, because it could carry something of these different histories or these different conditions, I guess. But the short answer is, in terms of, I hope that it'll fall into a few people's hands and that they'll play it and that it'll have a bit of a life. I wasn't thinking of putting all the tracks on Spotify, for example. I guess I could, but yeah.
Well, I suppose our what I was also maybe trying to get at, this kind of extension of this kind of Earth archive, the kind of pressing of an Earth archive. I really like that there is a way of kind of extrapolating out from the kind of the way that you've been thinking about materials holding kind of archival information to the kind of the vinyl somehow kind of incorporating that information, and like you say, also embedding this kind of quite kind of complex information that might not necessarily be caught by other mediums. So yeah.
Yeah, I think that you really there's something about playing a vinyl album. I think it really, and with all of this really wide frequency range of the that you hear with the ice, especially low frequencies, and you can hear that in certain moments. Like vinyl is an amazing material for really capturing that sort of granular texture, I think, of sound. Yeah, in a way that, say, like sort of digital interpolation tends to smooth over by the very nature of what it's meant to do. I mean, I realize that a vinyl record is in some way made with, like, obviously it's plastics and it comes out of a history of, like, consequently, oil. So the material is also part of the problem, right?
Suzanne, I want to say thank you for bringing this record to us and sharing it within the context of this event. I would also like to say thank you to Elias and Carl-Oscar for somehow kind of working this kind of technical wizardry into some sort of coherent form. And I hope you've been able to capture it. But I'm not sure if anybody has any kind of pressing questions or kind of final comments before we close. Otherwise, I will say thank you again. And we look forward to seeing you in some of shape or form, or at least in your work and how it kind of extends into other kind of materials and other formats. I mean, I'm really kind of quite excited by what's next on the horizon. But thank you, Susan, and good luck with all the work. And I'm sure everybody's give you a clap, and I can point you.
Yeah. It's so funny. I just can't. It's cutting out. I guess I can't hear anything, but I'm sure it was there. Strangely enough. But thank you for.
There were people clapping.
Yeah. Okay. No, just thank you so much for the setting it all up, and like I would have loved to have been there, and the whole biennial looks really kind of amazing from the images that I've seen online. So I'm sure it's been a kind of wonderful project for people to engage in. So just thanks so much for making the time to share this ice record with folks that are there.
Pleasure. And for those, we have a limited amount of copies should anybody want to purchase one. But otherwise, they're available from Beck in Bergen. Is that correct?
Susan? Yeah, they have. We each have about 50 of them. We made 100 in total. Yeah.
So, great. Thank you.
Okay, Ankur. Thank you. Bye-bye. Good evening. Have a good evening. Cheers. Yeah.
Recording stopped.
Thank you, everybody.
More contemporary, sort of synthetic kind of acoustic.